I call it the jar. No phone or utility lines coming in, self-contained, unplugged from the world. Nothing for a wire bug to piggyback in on. It leaves only transmitters. It's easy enough to signal sweep for those. So the government's been in bed with the entire telecommunications industry since the 40s. They get into your bank statements, your computer files, your email, listen to your phone calls. The more technology you use, the easier it is for them to keep tabs on you. It's a brave new world out there. At least it better be.
Welcome back. This is episode 17 of The Lockdown, the Practical Privacy and Security podcast, recorded on October 10th, 2024. Now, in today's show, we have a lot to cover. First, I'll be discussing privacy during a natural disaster. Now, in the past few weeks, there have been a number of natural disasters around the world, including some hurricanes in the United States, with Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton hitting Florida. So what do we do when giving people phone numbers, trying to stay in contact with neighbours or even loved ones, as well as usage of satellite with iOS 18 to send messages and Starlink for internet? So we'll be talking much more about that. Then we're going to discuss self-hosting Nextcloud, which accompanies a blog post that I recently published, which will go into detail of how I host Nextcloud in my home environment, and then how we back all that up with Backblaze B2 and Restic, making sure we have encrypted backups in the cloud. Then we'll end the show talking about Firefox. There's been a recent vulnerability and why I have switched to LibreWolf. First off, I have rebranded the website. Don't worry, the podcast stays as it is. That's still called The Lockdown. Because I do more than just the podcast, I wanted to make sure the website captured that. So it's now psysecure.com. That's PSY secure.com. Now, lockdown.media will just redirect there, so it doesn't matter. You can still get to it on the old URL. But now the podcast has moved to its own page on psysecure.com, but that also allows me to have PsySecure as the blogging platform as well. Now, I also decided to come off Twitter, or X, whatever you want to call it. It was just a waste of my time. I'm not a fan of social media anyway, and I really don't think many of you were following the account or needed it for updates when episodes come out. You know, if you subscribe to the podcast, you're going to get updated anyway with whatever podcast app you use. And that said, the best way to get in touch is still through the email, which is lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com. Now, there's also Patreon. Again, this is entirely optional. You can actually join for free. And if you want to support the show, there are some paid options as well. For that, I'm very grateful. And the links for all of that is on the website and in the show notes. Now, it's been an interesting few weeks. I was actually going to record a show last week, but then Hurricane Helene came into the US. There's a property I own which was completely cut off. The road turned into a river. Power lines went down. Mobile service was non-existent. And I had a lot of neighbours that were trapped. So I've been very busy at the weekend helping them. I feel like I've been to a strongman competition this weekend. So I ache and I'm on ibuprofen and lots of coffee to get through that. So that made me think, okay, well, let's record a podcast episode on natural disasters, because it was like a war zone. In times like these, you need to be able to get in touch with friends, family, and perhaps other people in the community as well. I had a number of neighbours say to me, "What's your phone number? I'll text you if there's power back," or whatever it may be. You need to coordinate, you need to plan. So I gave them a Sudo number, but obviously for that, I need internet access. I've always said this, and I'm going to remind you all again. Personal safety, human safety, comes first. I didn't give my real SIM number. It wasn't a life and death situation. Had it been, I would have done that. There was one night where I had to switch back to my iPhone because of the satellite communication feature. Now, this feature is incredibly useful if you are off-grid with no cell phone service. First of all, you have to be using iOS version 18, but then you can enable messages via satellite which will help you, contact friends or family if you are stuck. Now, for human safety, I think this is really important, and you're not going to get a feature like this on Graphene OS, unfortunately. Now, I believe it's only available in the US and Canada. I'm hoping they actually expand that to other regions in the world. I don't know what satellites it uses or what the limitations are there, but if you are going off grid, this is a significant feature. Now, I believe the recipient also has to be on iOS 18 as well. Now, when you access the Messages app on iPhone and you have no cell phone service, it will ask you if you want to turn on messaging via satellite. And you can also send your location via satellite as well. Now, I don't typically do this and share my location, but in this case, it was 2 days where I was not contactable, and I wanted to reassure my wife that I was still alive. So I actually used the Find My feature to send my location using a satellite. Now, you do have to have a clear view of the sky, and the first night was very cloudy, it was raining, I could not get it to work. But on the second night, I could see the stars, so I walked outside. Now, you can see an icon on the screen of where the satellite is, and you have to point your phone in that direction. It takes about a minute, and then it's connected. Then it sent my location and also sent my message. And again, human safety is the most important thing, especially in a natural disaster. But that also got me thinking well, perhaps I should invest in a satellite phone. But then I went down the rabbit hole and looked into Starlink. They are offering a free month for Hurricane Helene relief. So it will cost you $0. You still have to pay for the hardware, which is $299. But for the residential plan, you get the first month for free. So $299 plus $20 shipping and then taxes. That will cost you whatever your tax is, $340, for example. However, they do offer different plans. So the Helene relief is just for the residential plan. That's a fixed location, so you have to have an address in one of those affected areas. But they also offer this roaming plan, which is great for nomads and nerds like me, I guess. That's $50 a month. And it's limited to 50 gig, but if it's for occasional use, that's going to be more than enough. Or $165 a month for their Roam Unlimited plan. They offer other plans for boats, and there's also business plans as well. Now, from a privacy standpoint, you've got to bear in mind that Starlink, due to the technology and the fact it's connecting to satellites, is going to know exactly where you are. Not only does the app have location access for you to configure the actual device, but I think the Starlink antenna, the actual dish, that's going to know exactly where it is as well. It's connecting to satellites after all. That said, I'm pretty sure you can order Starlink in an alias name, especially if you're using a privacy card. I know they don't allow delivery to a PO box, but there's nothing stopping you delivering to, for example, a UPS store address or a private mailbox. Now, I'd love to hear from you if you've ordered Starlink, perhaps in an alias name, and you have further thoughts around privacy. One thing I did look into was DNS, and it does allow you to set your own custom DNS as well. And you can also configure the Starlink device to connect to a router. So it'd be like bridge or modem mode on a traditional ISP router. So you could use Starlink with pfSense, and then you have always on VPN as well. Now, why even consider Starlink at all? Well, this episode is largely about natural disasters, and there have been so many, not only across America of late, but around the world. And I think having a Starlink Mini with their roaming plan, and by the way, you can pause that, so you don't have to pay for it all the time. You can just activate it as and when you need it, I think is a really good option for your personal safety. And from a privacy standpoint, if you look at your threat model, you can still have this in your real name. Your ISP at home is potentially in your real name. But if you get that delivered to a UPS store or a private mailbox and you only use it outside of your home, you have an emergency option should you need it that's not tied to your physical home address and can still be used, if you choose to do so, with pfSense and an always-on VPN. Now, back to the situation I was in over the weekend. I did have a bug-out bag with me. It's something I keep in my car. And I'll read off what's in there. I have an emergency contacts list. I don't know about you, but I can't actually remember the majority of my family and friends' phone numbers. So having this emergency contact list on a notepad, including things like the hospital, doctor, evacuation locations, is really important. Now, some of that information isn't always available straight away, but just having a notepad and pen is really useful. Some spare socks and underwear. I had some spare clothes, gloves, scarf, some t-shirts, a first aid kit, trauma bandage, eye wash, hydrogen peroxide spray. I have no idea why I put that in there, but I did anyway. I had $400 in cash in the bag, a tourniquet. Now, one thing I did have is a power bank, but it was really small and actually didn't provide much use. I've actually ordered a new power bank now, which is the Anker Prime 27,650 milliamp hour power bank. That's 250 watts, and it comes with a 100 watt charging base. Now, the reason I got this is if I ever get Starlink, those USB-C ports provide 100 watts, which is enough to power the Starlink Mini. Now, that battery pack is small enough to go in my bag, and it's around $235. Not cheap, but it packs quite a punch. I also have in the bag a water filtration straw. Should I need to drink from a stream, it filters out anything bad and stops me getting sick. A flashlight. I had some medication, such as ibuprofen. Safety glasses, duct tape, which didn't come in useful at all, but you never know. Deodorant, a razor blade, some shaving gel. I've got some pepper spray. Again, it depends where you are, but there's certain locations, especially in more rural areas, in certain areas of the US, where you might encounter bears or any threat. So it's good to have some pepper spray. Earplugs, rain ponchos, face masks, and for some reason I've got a USB storage drive in there. Not sure why, but didn't come in any use at the weekend, but that's what I have. Now, what was I missing? I was missing a lot. Food, snacks, toothbrush, toothpaste, a lighter to light a fire. Those are the things I need to add, as well as the power bank. But also things it's worth adding if you can is perhaps a scanner. Now, I do have a Uniden digital scanner. It's the BCD 436HP. It's quite expensive. They're about $550. Now, I just want to take you back to the 90s. When I first got into radio, I was actually on CB radio in the 80s and 90s. And this was a time when analog radio scanners were a lot of fun because you could listen to mobile phones, typically only one side of the conversation, but cordless house telephones, baby monitors, the police, ambulance. You could listen to a lot, and it was very interesting. Now, the way the digital scanners work is you enter a zip code and it downloads all the frequencies of the communications in the area, and then it just scans between all those frequencies. I don't really like it that much. I prefer the old-fashioned method of having an analog scanner where I just type my start and end frequency and it just scans repeatedly until it picks something up between those ranges. They're also a lot cheaper. But these days, things like the police often use encrypted communications and many others as well. So you can't always pick up a great deal. But in an emergency, I think this would become very useful. But I did not have that in the bag. Now, I think I alluded to this earlier. I do typically carry two phones. I have an iPhone and also my Graphene OS phone, which is on Pixel 8 Pro. But at least carry a spare phone, even if you don't have an extra SIM card in there, just in case something happens to your phone and you're in the middle of nowhere. Now, one of the things I do keep at home is a Honda EU 2200i inverter generator. I think they're around $1,000, maybe just over, but they provide over 2,000 watts of power, and they will power a refrigerator, a coffee machine, lights, things like that. And you can actually buy the companion version so that you end up basically with two. You interlink between them and then you double the capacity. So very useful if you have a power outage for an extended period. And it's become very handy to, if anything, just to stop the food from going bad if the power's out for a day or more. Now, in my car, I like to also carry a separate first aid kit, some eye wash, a flashlight, and some tools as well. Okay, moving on then, let's talk about self-hosting. Now, I recently published a blog post on Nextcloud. So if you go to my new website, scisecure.com, The latest blog is Self-Hosting Nextcloud for Privacy the Right Way. And the reason I called it that is there are many guides out there on how to install Nextcloud, whether that's natively on Linux or using containers or various other methods. But I believe this is the right way of doing it. So I am using containers. But here's some differences. I am not exposing Nextcloud to the internet. Even if I keep my Ubuntu machine patched and updated and keep Nextcloud updated, I don't know if there's a 0-day vulnerability that would allow someone to access my files on Nextcloud. And should that be exposed to the internet, that risk is just significant. So I keep that local on the home network only. So when I'm on Wi-Fi, my phone will sync the photos, I can sync the password database, I can download files for offline use. So if I've got some files in Nextcloud, I can make them available offline. But all that syncing across all the devices stays within the home. Nothing leaves the house whatsoever. I do use a valid domain name. So that could be nextcloud.yourdomain.com. Now, I discussed this in great detail in the blog post, but the reason for that is so I can use Let's Encrypt for valid SSL certificates. Sure, I could use self-signed certificates, which basically means it's not going to be trusted, but then I have the pain where all my devices, that could be a phone, a tablet, laptop, they're all going to come up with a warning, do you want to trust this? This is self-hosted, and you have to add an exception. I didn't want that. I wanted to have a valid certificate, and the way around that, being not exposed to the internet, is to use something called DNS01. So basically I add a text record to that domain name. So it's a valid domain name on the internet, but there's no access to my Nextcloud instance at home. But what that enables Let's Encrypt to do, and certbot, is to actually renew the certificate, obtain the certificate and validate that, yep, I actually own the domain name. They need some way of proving that I own that domain name and I'm not obtaining a certificate for somebody else. I wanted to make this very easy to rebuild. Should something go wrong, if you needed to perhaps deploy a new machine with Ubuntu on it, you could very quickly start from scratch and rebuild this. Obviously use your existing config, use the existing database, but move that across to a new instance. And running Docker, you can delete the Docker containers, you can recreate them again. They're pretty much ephemeral. So you can start from scratch as long as your data disk is still there and your database is still available, then you can redeploy fairly easily. But Nextcloud also presents a number of errors and warnings. If you've tried this before and you go into the administration page on Nextcloud, I'm sure you're familiar with all the different errors and warnings that it can show. It's quite sensitive, so I have a section on that as well. But I have had a few of you send me an email asking what I do for my servers. So I want to go through that in detail today and just talk about self-hosting. So the blog post is up if you want to install Nextcloud, but let's just focus a moment on what I run all this on. Now, my home network is a mixture of wired and Wi-Fi devices. So the PC I use day to day does not use Wi-Fi. You know about pfSense. I've written a blog post on that as well on scisecure.com. You've got the complete guide to pfSense. But as far as networking is concerned, I do have Wi-Fi in the house and I use the Ubiquiti access points for that. And that's all controlled by a Ubiquiti Unify Cloud Key Gen 2 Plus. In other words, that's like a small server and it runs the controller software on there so I can manage all of the access point devices. Now, I used to run a Ubiquiti Edge switch. It was a 24 port switch managed as well, so it had VLAN support on there, but that was only a gigabit switch. And I say only, a gigabit switch is still more than enough for what most people need. But I did want to upgrade to 10 gigabit, and that's because I do some video work separate from all of this, and I do have some very large files, and I need to back them up to the server. Now, I'll get onto backups in a moment, but as far as the switch is concerned, I run now a MikroTik, so that's MikroTik, 12 port 10 gig switch. Now, they are currently, as I'm recording this, available on Amazon for around $589. That's obviously US. That gives me the ability to run 10 gig networking, and it has support for VLANs as well. Now, I also have another Ubiquiti Edge switch. It's not the 24 port that I used to use. It's actually an 8-port managed PoE plus, that's power over Ethernet. And that is what I use to power the access points and also some cameras that I have around the house. So there's 2 switches and they're linked together. So I've got 10 gig and then this 8-port gigabit switch just for the Wi-Fi access points and some cameras. So that gives me the best of both. I have power over Ethernet on gigabit and I also have 10 gig. You could probably do all of this if you're starting small with a Netgear switch, which you could probably get for less than $100 and run VLANs. And the reason I run VLANs, and I think I've mentioned this in the past, is I like to segment my network as much as possible. Okay, then for a very long time, I was using 2 QNAP TS659, I think there may have been 669 Pro NAS devices. So these come with 6 hard drive bays, and you can put 6 hard drives in there. They're only gigabit on the network, but this would be a NAS device. So for example, using NFS, which is Network File System, over the network you can mount a volume on the NAS device and use that for storage. Now, I first got these devices around 2009, so I've been running them for well over 15 years. I actually still have them. They're slower. They're not as good as the Synology, which I have. But for something like Nextcloud, they are still solid options, and you can probably get them fairly cheap on eBay or even Amazon. Now, the upgraded storage solution I have is a Synology 8-bay disk station. It's a DS1823XS Plus. Now, the reason I got that is it has built-in 10 gigabit Ethernet connectivity, but also it's quite compact given that you have 8 bays. Now, they're not cheap. They're around $1,800 and that's empty. But considering how much storage I actually need, I've got about 48 terabytes of usable storage. It's a really solid option. Now, one of the things I looked into before I purchased this was to run TrueNAS. Now, TrueNAS is an open source solution where you can basically build an old PC or an old server and turn it into a NAS device. I had this up and running. I had an old PC and I put 6 disks in there. The problem was in an old PC case, the cable management was an absolute nightmare. I ended up having disks get disconnected and I had to keep opening it up and checking the connections were secured properly. If that doesn't bother you, TrueNAS is a very cheap way of getting a lot of capacity presented as a NAS solution on your home network, especially if you have an old PC lying around. But you do have to make sure the power supply has enough capacity to run all the disks, and this thing is going to be good enough to be leaving powered on all the time. Now, the last thing I wanted, especially when I'm traveling, is that the storage goes down and my wife and kids start complaining, which is why I went for Synology. It's very easy to add and remove disks, and it's a very compact unit. Now, I will say, no matter what you do, I would not recommend connecting any of these to the internet. What I mean is a lot of these have remote access solutions, portals, so you can open up your firewall and manage these remotely. That's just asking for trouble. In fact, I was watching Network Chuck. He has a YouTube channel. This may have been about a year ago now. And I was stunned to see one of his videos where he was demonstrating access to, I think it was the Synology NAS, and he left the URL on the video, which I could access and anyone else could access, and it probably wouldn't take much to hack into that and access all of his files. Not a good idea. I don't connect anything like that to the internet. Hence, I run pfSense, and I have VLANs, and I have separation, and I make sure all this is blocked. In fact, someone actually asked me over an email recently, what do I do for cameras? I actually have multiple cameras around the house. Now, I have been using Amcrest cameras. I don't trust them at all. So it goes without saying, they don't have any internet access. In fact, I intentionally block these by IP address. In fact, they're on their own VLAN, and that VLAN has no internet access at all. So there's no updates, there's no time sync, but that doesn't bother me. I just want to use them for cameras to see when I'm connected to the home network. And as for recording the footage, I use Blue Iris. Now, that's something I do pay for. You have to pay, I think, an annual support fee just so you get updates. I'm not overly thrilled about that. I would prefer a better solution. It's not open source, And I'll be honest, it's a bit clunky. A lot of people love it. I probably have high expectations, but what it does do is allow me to record all of the cameras on my NAS. I have a virtual machine running Blue Iris, and there's a ton of storage attached to that virtual machine from the Synology NAS, and it records onto that. Okay, I wanted to get that part out of the way. So that's networking and that's storage. And I touch on some of this, especially storage, in the blog post. Now, if you just want to run Nextcloud at home, the cheapest, most minimally viable option is to probably find a laptop or an old PC. You could even run Nextcloud Pi on a Raspberry Pi if you have one of those. The downside of this is, if you want full disk encryption, it makes it a little more complicated. I'm sure there's a way of doing it with Nextcloud Pi. It's not something I've done. So let's just focus on an old desktop PC or laptop to start with. You could install Ubuntu directly onto that machine. And as part of the Ubuntu installation, it will ask you if you want to encrypt the disk. So that's great. If you have enough disk capacity in that PC or laptop, whatever it may be, then you're good to go. You can encrypt the disk and store everything there. That's the most simple option. But if you did want to use a NAS device and encrypt that as well, then mounting an NFS volume isn't going to help you. Now, I touch on this in the blog post, but essentially with Ubuntu, if you want to use full disk encryption with something called LUKS, that's LUKS, it needs to see it as a block device. In other words, a physical hard disk or a SAN disk. So this is a storage attached network. So that's iSCSI. Now, I don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole here, but if you have a laptop or desktop PC with a physical disk in there, you're good to go. You can install Ubuntu and do full disk encryption and then follow the rest of the blog post. If you want to use NAS storage, perhaps to the Raspberry Pi or a laptop or a desktop PC, and you want to take advantage of full disk encryption without complicating matters with iSCSI or other block storage options, this is what I would do. I would run either VMware, which is available to some if you're part of the vExpert program. There's other ways of acquiring it, or Proxmox. Proxmox is a free open source alternative to VMware, and it's a really solid option. It can do everything that VMware does, in my opinion. I worked for them for over a decade, so I should know. Now, if you install Proxmox on an old PC, this enables you then to create a virtual machine. Now, the benefit of this is you can present your NAS storage over NFS, that's Network File System, to Proxmox or VMware, whatever it is you're using for virtualization. And then when you create that virtual machine, you can then add a virtual disk. Now, the reason I like this is two reasons. Number one, that gives me some portability. If I wanted to move that machine to better hardware in the future, then I can. It's not tied to that machine. If I just installed Ubuntu directly on a laptop, for example, and later on I wanted to invest in a server, then it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to move that from the laptop, at least not without rebuilding everything, to the server. So virtual machines are incredibly portable. Secondly, because Proxmox in this case, or VMware, has the NFS storage attached, when you add the disk to the virtual machine, Ubuntu sees it as any other hard disk. So in Linux, that could be /dev/SDA for the main disk and SDB perhaps for your data disk. And this is what I do. I attach a virtual disk to a virtual machine. I used to run a 4 terabyte virtual disk, but you can go much bigger than that now. And that's where my Nextcloud files are, the actual data for myself and everyone in my house. So let's just take a few steps back. Aside from the network, you've got to decide on the storage, whether you're going to use storage in a desktop PC or a laptop, or step it up a level and use something like a NAS device, that's Synology or QNAP, something along those lines, even TrueNAS. So while you can install Ubuntu directly to the PC or the laptop, you're not going to have the flexibility you would with a virtual machine. Now, bear in mind, what I do is not just for Nextcloud. I have about a dozen other virtual machines that I run. I run 2 Supermicro servers. They're the SysE300 9D. They're available on Amazon. They come with Intel Xeon processors. I believe they're 2.2 gigahertz. And my servers have 128 gig of RAM in each of them. You have to buy the memory separately. But these are very compact. They're not the quietest. They're fairly noisy. So you do have to have somewhere to put them, but they're not loud like you would expect in a data center. But they're very small. Now, I have two of these because I run VMware vSphere. So while I was mentioning Proxmox earlier, I still have access to VMware licenses through the vExpert program. But that really is the only reason I run VMware. Proxmox would do just the same thing. So you could run that and have two servers in my case. Now I have the ability to run something called HA, or high availability. So if one of those physical servers dies on me, that virtual machine will just restart on another one. That may be going a bit extreme. If you're interested in that setup, feel free to reach out. But now I have my virtual machine for Nextcloud with a virtual disk attached to that, which physically sits on my NAS storage. So I've got a whole bunch of storage there. And I can easily extend that disk in the future. I can move that virtual machine to different hardware. It really is a good option. And again, you don't have to run two servers. You could even buy one of these and add one later, or just have one forever. It's fine. Now, you may be curious what other virtual machines I'm running. So I have two DNS servers. I actually run Pi-hole on each of them. And Pi-hole has something called Unbound. If you're interested in what that is, you should check out my blog post called The Foundations of Digital Privacy Beyond VPN, where I talk about that. But essentially, that's running my own DNS on my home network. And running Pi-hole means I can block certain categories of websites, for example, stuff that's not appropriate for my kids to access. Now, I also run another virtual machine for SyncThing. It's running Ubuntu Linux. That seems to be my favorite Linux distribution these days. In fact, for many years, I think since 2004, so almost 20 years, I was using CentOS, which is a clone basically of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. But CentOS is no more, not in the format it used to be in, so Ubuntu is the way I go now. Now, SyncThing is an open source file sync software. That's probably one way of putting it. But that's also excellent. You don't have to use Nextcloud for everything. Now, I mentioned earlier I work with some very large video files. So on my desktop PC, I have about 14 terabytes of local disk storage. Now, one of the drives is dedicated for video, and these are raw video files. They're incredibly large, and some of that I need to keep, or certainly need to back that up. Now, rather than using Nextcloud to do that, these are massive files. It's really not a good use case. I use SyncThing. So SyncThing can monitor a folder on my desktop PC, in this case video, and then sync that to a server. You can have one-way sync, two-way sync. It's kind of a backup. I wouldn't rely on it as a backup, but it's another device where your data is stored. Now, I'll talk about backups in a moment. I have an OSINT folder, which has a huge amount of data in there. I'll leave that to your imagination, what I've got going on in there. But that also backs up to my SyncThing server, which has a large amount of storage presented as a virtual disk, which is backed by my NAS. Then I have my Blue Iris server, so that's for my cameras. That records again onto a virtual disk, which is backed by the NAS, and that has all my video recordings. And then I also run Jellyfin. Jellyfin is an open source media player. So again, I've told you I work with a lot of video files. I can present the finished video, not all this raw stuff, but the finished edited video to the media server, and then anyone in my house can watch those videos. Now, where you get your movies and TV shows from, I am not going to get into that. But let's say the legal way you do it, you wanted to rip all your own DVDs and Blu-rays and store those so you can watch them on your own media server, then Jellyfin is really good for that. Now, because I don't need to have full disk encryption on Jellyfin, these are literally just video files, movies, TV shows, things like that. I don't need to present that media disk as a virtual disk. I don't need to do that. I can just mount the NFS volume from one of the NAS devices straight to Jellyfin. But because of that, I have tens of terabytes of storage available for this media. So Jellyfin, I highly recommend it. I think it's an excellent project. I would not touch Plex with a barge pole. I used to run Plex many years ago. I think the thing that broke the deal for me was when my internet went down one day. And despite the fact I hosted all my own media files and I ran the server at home, it wouldn't let me log in. And it was crazy. It relies on an internet connection to log in. Now, whether or not they've changed that or not, I don't know. But then there's the telemetry that gets sent to Plex. It just deviated from what it was originally meant to be, and I do not touch it now. Jellyfin is entirely local. If I have no internet whatsoever, I don't care. I can just access Jellyfin from an iPad, from Apple TV, from a desktop computer, any of the devices in my home, and watch the media that way. And then finally, I've got another virtual machine I call Dev, and that's how I run the website. So just so you know, my website, lockdown.media and scisecure.com, runs Jekyll, which is a static HTML generator. I want to keep the attack surface as minimal as possible. The less attack vectors there are, such as databases, WordPress is a terrible example. It's full of vulnerabilities. There's numerous ways of hacking a WordPress site. I wanted to come away from that. So what I do, I have this virtual machine, again running Ubuntu, that I call Dev. Then from my laptop on my PC, I connect to that over a terminal using SSH, and I run Jekyll on there. So I can then build the site in Jekyll. This is going off on a slight tangent, but I wanted to share it with you. And it builds the site, and then I can open up my browser on my desktop PC and see the site locally running on that Dev machine. I use Visual Studio Code to make changes. So all of the blog posts, for example, they're markdown files. I write the blog, I can add my images, I do all that through VS Code, and then Jekyll builds the site. When I'm happy with it, I actually use GitHub to store the repository for the site. So there's a GitHub repo for the website. I commit and push that change to GitHub. Then I have a machine out there on the internet which picks up a webhook. This is getting a bit technical now, but it listens basically to when GitHub's received a new commit, so a change to the website. And then the server on the internet builds the static HTML, and then that's what you see when you visit the website. So perhaps I should do a show on that, but it's not entirely privacy related. So if you're interested, go to Patreon. You can message me on there, or you can still email me, which is lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com. Either way, you can get in touch, and I'm happy to share some details on that. All right, so I think I've covered everything there. There's a lot to go through. I have a MikroTik network switch, I have the Supermicro servers, Ubiquiti access points, Amcrest cameras for video, but they're completely blocked from the internet. And by the way, I do have OpenVPN, which is certificate-based. I run that on pfSense. So when I need to look at the video, I can connect from my mobile device, or any device for that matter, to VPN, and then I can open up the web UI for Blue Iris, which I run as a virtual machine. So one thing to add is I do have a UPS, but I have modified it. So I run an APC 1500 VA smart UPS. So nothing too significant, but because of the power draw, I have added some additional batteries. And the batteries I chose are the Lossigi 12 volt 20 amp hour Life PO4 battery, basically the deep cycle lithium batteries. Now I have 4 batteries, 2 of them are connected in series, and then each pair is connected in parallel. So I get 24 volts for the UPS. Obviously I've added a fuse just in case there's an issue, and it is a bit of a hack, but in the event of a power cut, I get significantly more. It's actually hours of usage rather than just a few minutes with the internal UPS battery. I feel like I've gone off on a complete tangent there, so let's get back to privacy and security. Now, self-hosting all of this yourself is all well and good until you have disk failures or hardware failures or some sort of outage that means you have to recover this. So we need a secure way of backing it up. Now, if we were using cloud services such as Proton Drive, then they do that for you. I would still recommend you back that data up, but it's less of a risk. When you're running all this at home, you just got to imagine, what if there was some catastrophic disaster and you lost all of that? Where are you backing this up to? So here is my solution, and it's a combination of using Backblaze B2 and a tool called Restic. Now, this really does warrant a blog post to go into the level of detail that's needed. So I thought I'd actually try something different. I haven't had time to write the blog post yet, but I have got my raw notes. Now, rather than just read all my notes to you, which is going to be incredibly boring and probably confusing, I actually used a Google service. Now, don't panic. I'm using a throwaway Google account, alias name, it's all fake information, and my notes don't contain anything sensitive at all. But this is something called Notebook LLM. If you haven't seen it, it's an AI speech processor that reads out notes or source material as if it was two podcast hosts discussing it and going deep into the subject matter. And it has actually done a really good job of distilling my notes, which I must admit are a bit of a mess because it's not in a blog post yet, and explaining it in quite a good level of detail. So I'm going to share that with you now. If you hate this, email me, and I promise I won't do it again. So here is the discussion by two AI entities.
So you're using Restic, which is a command line tool that's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of backups, and you're pairing it with Backblaze B2 for storage. Now, B2 is known for being super affordable, especially when you compare it to some of the bigger cloud storage providers.
It really is. Yeah, it's a hidden gem for sure.
Yeah.
You get the peace of mind of having offsite backups without it, without breaking the bank.
Exactly. And you've even taken things a step further by customizing your B2 bucket and set it to only keep the latest version of each file. Expert speaker, can you talk about why that's such a smart move?
So it's all about efficiency. See, Restic is fantastic at incremental backups, which basically means it's only storing the changes you make to a file. And that obviously saves a ton of space, but over time you might end up with a lot of old versions. So by just keeping the latest one, you're basically streamlining your storage and keeping those costs down.
That's brilliant. So it's like having this self-updating archive, always prioritizing the most current version of your data. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of your setup. You're using apt to install Restic, which makes perfect sense if you are running a Debian-based system like Ubuntu, for example. Think of like the App Store for your server. It handles all that downloading and installing for you.
Right, exactly. And speaking of streamlined processes, your instructions also highlight environment variables, and this is where things get really elegant.
Oh, yeah. Environment variables. They always seemed a bit mysterious to me, I've got to say. What's the magic behind them?
So think of them like pre-filled forms, but for Restic. You store all the important information, things like your B2 account details and the repository location, within these variables. And that way Restic automatically knows where to find everything without you having to type it out every single time you run a backup.
That makes so much sense. It's like having a dedicated key ring just for backup data. Everything's in one place and easily accessible by the right program.
Exactly. And it's not just about convenience either. It's actually a major security boost as well. Because imagine if you accidentally embedded your B2 credentials directly in your command line instructions. That would be a hacker's dream come true.
Talk about a nightmare scenario. So, environment variables keep things organized, they're secure and efficient. It's a win-win-win. Now, your instructions also mention using Sudo. That seems like a pretty big deal. What's the rationale behind that?
Telling me it is. It is a big deal. Yeah, root is kind of like the master key to your entire system. It can basically access and modify anything. Now, you wouldn't want to operate with that level of access all the time, right? Way too risky.
Right, you could really mess things up with one wrong move as root.
Exactly. So that's where Sudo comes in. Think of it as like temporarily borrowing the root user's powers, just for like one specific task. In this case, you're using Sudo to basically give Restic the permissions it needs to really access and back up your entire system, including those critical system files.
So it's like we're giving Restic just enough access to do its job without leaving the system vulnerable.
Exactly. Now, you're also setting up cron jobs. And for those, running as root or using Sudo is often essential because cron needs to be able to run those backups even when you're not logged in, right?
Yeah, cron jobs are like the unsung heroes of data protection.
Yeah.
Running in the background, they just make sure everything's backed up on schedule, even if we forget.
Exactly. Like setting an alarm clock, but way more reliable.
Oh.
And I see you've got 2 cron entries set up. One for your MySQL database dump every Saturday at 1 a.m. and another for a full data backup every Sunday at 1 a.m. Smart move backing up that database separately, by the way.
Yeah, so even if we forget to even think about backups, which, let's be real, that happens, Cron has our back. But it's not just a blind backup everything approach, is it? I noticed you're taking advantage of Restic's tagging, exclusion, and pruning features. Those seem really powerful.
Oh, they're game changers for sure. So let's start with tags. Think of them like labels for your backups. You can tag your backups as, critical, long-term, or really anything else that you want. Helps you categorize and manage those backups.
Oh, that's really useful. So if we ever need to restore, we can just find the exact backup we need without it turning into this huge time-consuming thing.
Right, exactly. And then we have exclusions. So let's say you have like a folder full of movies and you're always downloading new ones, deleting old ones. Do you really need to back those up every single time?
Probably not. They're just going to take up a bunch of space and slow things down.
Exactly. That's where exclusions come in. You're basically telling Restic, like, hey, ignore these files or folders. They're not important for the backup. And then finally, there's pruning. Pruning is kind of like spring cleaning for your backups.
Pruning. Okay, so we're talking about getting rid of old backups then, right? Sounds like that could save a ton of space if you've been doing this a while.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
Like I was saying, Restic's incremental backups are really amazing for efficiency, but you can end up with a ton of snapshots,
right?
Especially if you're not careful. Pruning basically lets you set up these rules for how long you actually want to keep different backups. Like you might want to keep daily backups for a month, maybe weekly backups for 3 months, that kind of thing.
So it's like the self-managing archive. You just set the rules and Restic takes care of the rest.
Exactly.
Now, beyond just the actual backup process itself, I saw your instructions mention using TMUX.
TMUX. It's a lifesaver, especially for running those really long backups.
I've definitely heard of it, but I'll be honest, I haven't had much experience with it. Could you maybe break it down for us a bit?
Okay, so imagine this. You start a big backup, right? But then you need to close your terminal window. Now, without TMUX, that would basically interrupt the whole thing. But with TMUX, it's different. Your backup can just keep running in the background. It's completely independent.
Okay. So even if I log out, shut down my computer, whatever, that backup's still going to be chugging along.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's it. Like having a separate computer, but just for your backups. And, to make things even better, you even included commands for checking those logs. You could even gracefully kill a process if you need to.
That's key. It's nice to have that peace of mind,
Yeah.
knowing you can monitor things and jump in if you need to, not just like hoping for the best.
Yeah, for sure. You have like total visibility and control. This is not just like blindly trusting the process,
This has been super insightful. I really appreciate it. You've walked us through all the why behind this really solid Restic and B2 setup. Before we wrap up, is there any final wisdom you want to impart on everybody listening?
Honestly, the best backup system is the one that you actually use. It sounds simple, but it's true. Make it a habit to test your setup regularly. Think of it like a fire drill for all your data you need to know. But it works before you actually need it.
Well, there you have it. This was a real deep dive into Restic and Backblaze B2. We went way beyond the basics here, but you're on your way to total data peace of mind. Congrats. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive. Now go forth and back up that precious data.
I think I'm actually screwed. They did a better job, or it did a better job than I could have done. One thing that the AI entities neglected to mention was encryption. Just to be clear, those environment variables they were talking about, there's another one called Restic_password_file. Now, basically, by default, Restic will encrypt all the data automatically, and it looks for that file, which will contain a strong password to encrypt the data. So you have to make sure that file is somewhere safe. So I make sure that's in a place where only root can access it. But that's heavily documented. As I mentioned, the Restic docs, I'll put a link in the show notes. That covers all of that in detail. Now, what do you think of that discussion by AI? I'd love to get your thoughts on it. I think it's a fun way of distilling information and absorbing information. And I don't think AI is going to take over our jobs. What I do think, though, is we have to start looking at AI as a tool. I've been using it extensively to help me with my coding. I use Whisper, which is a free tool by OpenAI, which is a command line tool. And I often use that to take audio and then transcribe it. And it does a very good job of transcribing it to a text file. And then I can feed that into something like ChatGPT to pick out the notes. I think AI as a tool going forward is going to significantly help us in our jobs. I don't think it's going to replace us. So I hope not anyway. Now, something else I want to highlight in today's episode before we close the show is CVE 2024-9680. That is a code execution vulnerability in Firefox. Now, for many, many years, Firefox has been my preferred browser, and it still remains that way, kind of. Just yesterday, I started using LibreWolf, which is a fork of Firefox. Now, this potentially, I believe it's still vulnerable to that vulnerability. Tor recently updated the Tor browser to 13.5.7, which includes the security updates to Firefox related to that vulnerability, which is a very significant one. It's a code execution flaw, which is going to put a lot of people at risk if they're still using that. So if you use Firefox, or you're using Tor, or any fork of Firefox, including LibreWolf, make sure you update it. Now, I'm recording this on October 10th, 2024, and it's not clear to me if all the derivatives of Firefox, such as LibreWolf, are affected by this vulnerability. But for now, I'm going to assume it is, so make sure you update. Now, I have been a fan of Firefox for many, many years, but I have decided just this week I'm going to finally put it to rest, and I've moved over to LibreWolf. Now, it's not because of this vulnerability. That's maybe part of it, but as I said, that vulnerability could be impacting other browsers as well. It certainly is on Tor. So if you cast your mind back to November last year, that's 2023, I wrote a blog post called Secure Settings for Mozilla Firefox. I also did the same for the Brave browser. And that was just stuff like asking where to save files on downloads, not automatically downloading files, setting the default search engine to DuckDuckGo or Start Page, setting the enhanced tracking protection to strict, and then making sure that cookies are deleted when Firefox is closed. And the way to then manage that is there's a manage exceptions option. So, for example, Proton Mail stays logged in. You can add Proton Mail to the exceptions and it won't clear the cookies every time you exit the browser. What I like about LibreWolf is it does all that by default, including the fact it doesn't send any telemetry. Now, Mozilla has had an interesting past, let's put it that way. One issue was the way they handled certificate errors and caching, which ultimately led to advertisers being able to de-anonymize users. Basically, there was a vulnerability which stemmed from the way they cached intermediate HTTPS certificates, allowing people to then de-anonymize you. That made me very nervous. That was some time ago. I'll put a link in the show notes to that. The fact that telemetry settings are enabled by default. I don't want my telemetry being enabled. Now, I don't know if a future update or change to Firefox is going to bring that back again. And then they have recently acquired a technology company called Anonym, which I think has further complicated Mozilla's position with the privacy community. Anonym is known for privacy-preserving ad measurement, or so they say. Their aim is to balance user privacy with the effectiveness of ads. I just think this is another step forward, though, of aligning Firefox more with behavioural advertising. And it's a matter of time when something goes wrong, whether that be through a vulnerability or some oversight, where this is going to have a significant impact to our privacy. Now, they also, if you cast your mind back 5 years ago, it was May 2019, all of the add-ons suddenly stopped working. So uBlock Origin, all the things I use. And that was because of an issue with the way they signed certificates. The certificate that was responsible for verifying the authenticity of all the add-ons had basically expired. Someone in Mozilla forgot to renew the certificate. So this then prevented Firefox from validating extensions, resulting in them being all disabled across the platform. And this impacted millions of users. And then there is the Firefox or Mozilla Studies system. And they actually fixed that vulnerability through that very system, which allows them to push emergency updates without requiring users to manually download anything. But that also leaves me with some concern. I don't want studies being enabled. I don't want this ability for Firefox to push changes all of a sudden without me knowing about it. So it's really because of all those reasons and just going with my intuition. I love Brave, but I don't love it enough to use it as my daily web browser. I still like Firefox at its core, but moving away from Mozilla to LibreWolf and using that, which is a fork of it, all those security settings in my blog post, pretty much all of them anyway, are defaults with LibreWolf. So I've been using that for the last few days. I haven't noticed any issues. It's exactly the same as my previous Firefox experience. And remember, it still could potentially be vulnerable to this latest vulnerability. So that's something I'm going to keep an eye on. Again, I'd love your opinions. Perhaps you use Brave and you prefer that than Firefox or any of these other alternatives. So with that, do let me know. lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com. Now, I think I have talked enough for today's episode, despite the assistance by Notebook LLM earlier in the podcast. So with that, we'll end it there. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, any questions, you can email me, lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com, or you can head over to Patreon. It's completely free to join as a member. If you want to have one of the paid options to support the show, that would be greatly appreciated, but not essential. So either one of those options, you can get in touch. And with that, talk to you soon.